It is now my pleasure to turn today's program over to Mark Bushy. Mr. Bushy, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mark Bushy. I'm the category manager here at Kimberly-Clark Professional, and I handle our KLEENGUARD brand industrial apparel portfolio here in North America. Just want to take a moment to thank MSC for making this possible today and helping bring this time together. So thank you, MSC, for doing this, and really looking forward to the content today, and hopefully you are as well. Just to give a quick overview of what we're going to cover today, really it's four main things that when you leave today we want you to leave with. The first is just an understanding of why do we wear disposable suits to begin with? What are the reasons that we actually wear this protective apparel? The second main question that we want to answer is how do we choose the correct protective apparel? What you'll largely realize and hear today is that there aren't a lot of easy answers when it comes to choosing and selecting the right PPE and protective apparel, but we want to make sure you're armed with the right questions to ask and really arm you with those questions. The third thing is really to understand where PPE selection falls short, and last but not least, as was mentioned earlier, we'll open the floor to some questions. So really just kicking this off, and I think this is probably second nature for many of you on the call, just the understanding of why safety is important. The one thing that we truly believe in many industries that we come across is that employees are the greatest asset and they should return home every night in the same way that they arrive to work. And that's very, very important. I think that's something we all take for granted, that when you show up for work, you're going to come home in the exact same shape. That's something we all need to keep in mind. And many of our cultures really embrace the safety culture, and I think that's really important. And part of the reason a lot of companies embrace that culture is truly a safe workplace leads to a more productive workplace, also a happy and fulfilled workplace. No one wants to come to an environment where they're just concerned about their safety and not sure if they're going to get injured or not. So it does lead to a happier and more fulfilled workforce. And then the other one, which is very, very important, is just from a cost reduction, cost avoidance standpoint. We all know that injuries can be extremely expensive for the employee, the organization, can be millions if not billions of dollars depending on the severity of the injury. So cost avoidance is also really, really important to keep in mind when we think about safety. Now, when we talk about safety, it's important to think about, we start with at-risk behaviors. And the one thing we want to address, and really why it's important to have that true safety culture, is we ultimately want to address at-risk behaviors before they escalate. As you can see on the left there, this pyramid shows the escalation and the probability of escalation. The important thing to realize is there's so many at-risk behaviors that happen every day, and if we address them at the stage that they're just at-risk behaviors, it really helps to make sure we're not further escalating that, and then ultimately we want to make sure we're avoiding that one fatality in the chart that shows there. But really this can be something like, you know, is someone texting while they're walking? Are they not wearing their eyewear correctly? Are they putting it on top of their head? In terms of suit, are they cutting the sleeves off of the suit or cutting slits in the side? These are all what we would consider at-risk behaviors, and there's something that should be addressed early on in the process. On the right-hand side, we show some of the prevalence of some of these fatal injuries, and really we circled the one that's most prevalent for the suit marketplace, and that's the exposure to harmful substances and in chemicals in particular. That's the one that we see most often in terms of fatal injuries. So people wear largely protective apparel to protect them from these things. So when we talk today, keep this in mind that this can escalate pretty quickly if we don't keep an eye on the at-risk behaviors that we need to address early on. Now, I know a lot of times we talk about the importance of PPE, and PPE is incredibly important. However, it's also important to remember that PPE isn't necessarily the first option. It's more of the last resort. And so this, you probably have seen this many times, the hierarchy of controls. There's a lot of things that we need to try to do to eliminate these hazards before we ultimately get to the need of PPE. So the example I like to use is if you see an extension cord laying on the ground, for example, you know, one thing that we could say in the PPE lens is we could just say, well, we're going to give everyone some padding to put on their elbows, a hard hat, because they're probably going to trip over that extension cord. Well, what you don't realize is there's a lot of things you can address before you get to that point. I know this example is a little extreme, but you can physically remove the extension cord, right? Can you move it to the side, put it away from where people are going to be moving? Can you replace the hazard? Is there another way to get power there without an extension cord? Can you actually have people walk around the extension cord? That's the engineering controls that we do. Or can we truly just change the way people are going to work? All of those things need to be addressed before you get to PPE. Now, PPE is very important, even though you try to do those 4 things above as often as you can. Sometimes at the end of the day, PPE needs to be worn. So what we want to do today is really focus on disposable apparel, and in particular how we're selecting that, because we know that PPE can be important, especially if you've gone through all these other controls before you get there. So in terms of disposable apparel, one of the most important reasons we want to protect ourselves is because it's our skin, and skin is the largest organ in our body. In fact, the average human has about 22 square feet of skin. That is a lot of square footage that is susceptible to chemicals, hazards that you may come in contact with. It's actually the largest organ that we have, and it's really important that we protect it with this apparel. The other thing is just the prevalence of skin-related diseases. So skin-related diseases account for 50% of all occupational illnesses and then 25% of all lost work days. So it's a very common thing to happen, and the reason why apparel is so important. And then just to further that point, we see that about 13 million workers in the U.S. are potentially exposed to chemicals that can be absorbed through the skin. So we can see this is a large organ. It happens often. So apparel is something that we need to really keep top of mind as we're thinking about PPE and what we should put our individuals in as they're going out to work every day. Well, to really get us started, when we select the right style of PPE and the right type of suit, we need to first address what is the hazard. And really what we see, and from my experience, what we see is 3 main buckets of hazards. The first being dry particulate, so kind of your dirt and dust, your liquids, which is water and some light chemicals, and then your true chemical protection and chemical hazards. So those are really the things that you don't want to be spending a lot of time in. They can be quite dangerous on the chemical end. The other thing we want to think about is really what is the purpose of the PPE? Is it just to keep me clean, or is it to keep me protected? You'll make a lot different decisions depending which of those questions you answer. If it's truly just to protect your clothing, you might not need as substantial of protection, but if it really is to protect you from some sort of hazard, then you really need to make a different decision. And so we'll jump in and really dig into a little bit more detail about each of these. We'll start with the dry particulates. Again, we address that very first question. Is it being used to protect the person or keep them clean? The thing with dry particulates is a lot of times these things can't even be seen. So one of the things we have to ask ourselves is really what is the size of the particle and how many microns is the particle? So when we use the term microns, it's basically the term that we use for really small sizes of particles. And as you see on the chart on the right, these are just some common substances that we see the size in microns. One of the things that's very difficult about this type of protection is you're making decisions a lot of times on things that the human eye can't even pick up and can't even see. So that's really, really important. And this is an area that I think a lot of times we often over-prescribe PPE in this environment only because we don't truly know the data about the dry particulates that are in our environment there. So when we talk about the micron size, it's really important to know what you're trying to protect against and ask those questions. Understand the micron size, because ultimately that will get you in the right suit and the right apparel. And then the last thing, last but not least, is the particle hazardous. So obviously you see on the chart to the right, something like anthrax is going to be something that obviously you do not want to get in touch with at all. But the decisions you make about something that hazardous versus something like the next one on the list, antiperspirant, makes a very big difference. Obviously understanding the hazard and what you're trying to address is going to be key to that identification. Turning over to the liquid hazard, a lot of the similar questions. Is it going to be used to protect the person or keep them clean? If I'm out in my driveway power washing something, I'm going to make a different decision than if I'm getting splashed with a certain chemical. So understanding how that liquid is going to be used is very, very important. The other thing, and the second point gets to this, is really understanding how the liquid is getting on you. You're going to make very different decisions if the liquid is being splashed on you every so often or very occasionally versus if it's power sprayed at you on a regular basis. And the way you can think about this is, you know, if it is a power washer type stream of liquid that's coming at you, you really need to think about how that's going to penetrate the suit. Is it going to get through the seams? Questions like that are going to be really, really important. And similar, like we talked about with the dry particulates, we're going to need to understand is the liquid hazardous. If absolutely no liquid can seep through the suit, you're going to make decisions to ensure that that's the case. Whereas if you're just using water and it's really to protect your clothing, you'll make a slightly different decision. And probably the most critical hazard identification, I would say, is really your chemical. And this is truthfully really where employees can get the most injured is if you're making not the right decisions when it comes to chemical protection. So really understanding the chemical that is being used as well as the concentration is really, really key. So for example, a chemical would be like sulfuric acid. If I say something is 98% concentrated, that's a very different solution than if I say it's 2% concentrated. You will make different PPE selections based on that concentration. The other thing that we think about is generally when we test chemical protection, we typically talk about the actual penetration of the chemical for really about 60 minutes. But understanding the duration of the workers and how long they're going to be exposed to the chemical is really, really important. The longer they're going to be exposed, the more substantial your protection needs to be. If it's just an incidental splash here or there, you're going to make different decisions. And then last but not least, we really talk about whether the suit needs to protect against just the liquid, or is it truly the gases and vapors. That's going to be very important because as you make decisions about chemical protection, you'll start thinking more about things like the seams. So as many of you may know, the seam of the garment, so where the garment's actually sewn together, is one of the most susceptible areas for penetration and leak through to happen. So when we talk about protecting against vapors, we start talking about tape seam garments, so actually adding that extra level of protection over the seam to ensure that that doesn't happen. So when we talk about the actual reasons we select PPE and the right disposable apparel, we want to keep these in mind because from my experience, we see a lot of key decision makers make decisions based on these criteria. And it truly comes down to KPIs and what they were rewarded on and what actually they get measured on a day-to-day basis. And we see 5 prevalent KPIs in the marketplace on a regular basis. That would be safety, quality, cost, productivity, and sustainability. So depending on which one of those is your sensitivity, or maybe it's a combination of all 5, you'll make different decisions. And we'll touch quickly on each one of these to just really address what questions you should be asking if you're concerned about each one of these. So we'll start with safety, and we talked about that one quite a bit. But the question that this person or these people are concerned with is, how do we keep our employees safe? You need to know what hazards are present, and you also need to know how to prevent them. So the hierarchy of controls that we showed earlier, the person in charge with safety is going to be really, really attuned to that, making sure that their employees are really, really safe. And at the end of the day, if they can't remove them, we want to know what suit works best for them. So one of the things in the blue boxes below are kind of things that we recommend to address these. The first blue box is really to have a distributor like MSC and a manufacturer's sales rep actually take a hazard walk at an end user facility, actually identify what hazards are there, and be an advisor to the end user customer there who's ultimately going to be wearing the suit. The other thing that I recommend that we do is really review technical information and regulations. So every disposable apparel in the marketplace, or most disposable apparels, actually publish information about the performance and physical testing data of every suit. So reviewing that ahead of time will really give you a good sense of how well it's going to protect. And last but not least, once you review the technical information, one of the best ways to get information is really to trial and test the different coverall options. It's hard to make decisions just from what a distributor tells you or what you see on paper. There's no better way than just to test the coverall and see how it works. The next big bucket is what we call quality. So this individual or these folks are worried about making sure that the output of their production is really not impacted. So they can't afford to have issues with the output. So the questions that you would ask is, will the suit break down or tear, leaving FOD or foreign object debris in the process? This can cause really, really expensive rework a lot of time if you get things in the process that shouldn't be there. And the other point that we have there is lint. You never really think about coveralls and suits of giving off lint, but that's incredibly important, especially as you start thinking about the painting process or something like that. Even the smallest of particles can really make a big difference and cause a lot of expensive rework. And then when we talk about the different components, will the threads, will the zippers, will different components fall into the process? Again, just examples of that foreign object debris that can cause a huge issue and really impact the output. So again, a lot of the same critical action items that I'd recommend, really reviewing the technical data sheets and physical properties, but also trialing and testing the different products. One other example that I'll bring here, we talked about like an aerospace or a painting industry, but food processing is another one, for example. No one wants to open their box of cereal and see any of this thing in there. That can be expensive, have a lot of brand damage, and something like apparel can obviously get in there if you're not being careful enough. So really important to ask these questions about quality. The other way that we do that, at least from our side, and making sure that the apparel really fits into the real standards, is we have a couple guiding principles and a couple guiding standards that help us. One being the ANSI standard that helps us make sure our sizing is in the right place, and also an ASTM testing standard to make sure that it passes certain chemical as well as blood penetration type things. So these are just things that we do to make sure our quality is in place to help ultimately you all ensure that your quality is up to standards at the end of the day. Another big aspect, and I know this is becoming more and more prevalent every day, is cost. And really the folks are going to be asking, how do we maximize our bottom line? So this one's really critical because you need to really think about, can you make sacrifices in quality to hit a number? A lot of times this is the old adage, you get what you pay for. And so a lot of times you need to understand and realize how you can really maximize the value of the suits. So when we talk cost here, it's not just the cost per piece, so how much you pay per actual coverall, it's more of a cost in use story. So even though you might buy a coverall that's a little bit more expensive up front, will it actually last longer and ultimately save you money in the long run? Those are the type of things you really need to think of. And especially when you think of cost, the one thing I'd say to be aware of is really over-engineered garments. A lot of times this is not a well-understood type of PPE, so a lot of times people just say, give me this white suit or give me this suit that will protect me, but at the end of the day you might be paying more than you truly need because you're getting an over-engineered garment. So having that conversation with your distributor rep, it really will go a long way. With your sales representative will go a long way in understanding really what is the right garment for the hazard I'm trying to protect against. The next big bucket is productivity, and this one is something that's really, really important. You don't want to have anything get in your way of your output metrics. You need to be a productive operation. In any business out there, you need to be productive and make sure that you're meeting your objectives. So in this standpoint, apparel really ties into your productivity more than you would think. And it really comes down to, are the workers comfortable in the garments? Are they actually ripping out their garments, causing them to have to replace their suits on a regular basis? This makes a big difference. Having folks that are constantly pulling up the sleeves of the garment, constantly changing their garment because it might have ripped out, not being able to move in the right way, all of these are costing your company time and money at the end of the day. So those little things, even though a slight tug of the sleeve might take a couple seconds, if you multiply that by a couple hundred employees doing it a couple hundred times a day, it has real ramifications for your productivity. The other big thing with productivity is, does your suit supplier deliver on time? The one thing we hear a lot about is, PPE is a valuable component to the everyday operations of your facility. So what we want to make sure is that if you truly need that PPE to be there to run effectively, that it's there on time. This is where we can see a lot of times some of our competitors really fall short, is they often leave customers out there without any true solution, having them to make decisions of, do I shut down production? So obviously we're all trying to do our best to make sure that doesn't happen, but something to really keep in mind when you're making the choice with your supplier of choice. And last but not least is sustainability, and this is another one that is a growing trend in the marketplace, and especially as more and more millennials get in the workforce, sustainability becomes more and more important. So we need to understand how to improve our waste to landfill metrics. Everyone's trying to reduce the waste that's out there. So when we talk about suits, we need to understand, can suits be recycled? Or are there ways to reduce carbon footprint? And I think the suits being recycled is kind of a term that doesn't come up that often, but it's something that we need to start asking the question more and more about. And something we're really proud about at Kimberly-Clark, and we do have an example here, is of our sustainability, and that's our Right Cycle program. So what we end up doing with our thin mill gloves as well as our disposable apparel, we offer a recycling option where at the end user facility they can collect the used garments, put them in a recycling box, it gets transported to our recycler, and then it gets really made into usable products again. So recycling something that traditionally had been thrown in a landfill is something great and offers a ton of sustainability benefit. So the last thing we said we would touch on is really where suit selection falls short. And I mentioned earlier, just a second ago, product availability. Make sure you're asking the right questions about service levels when you're selecting someone to provide your suits. That can make a big difference, and it's always, well, it's never fun to actually be left without a supplier whenever you need it most. The other big element is the protection level versus the hazard. Really make sure you're understanding what you're trying to protect against and ask questions. I mentioned a little bit about, especially when we talk chemicals, pay close attention to the seams. The seams is an area where you can actually have be susceptible to exposure, so ask questions about what level of seam protection is needed. I mentioned it just a second ago, your cost per piece versus cost in use. I find a lot, and a lot of my experience says that a lot of times when we're really looking to cut costs, we try to look at a cost per piece basis, but in the end of the day, if you're just using something that's cheap and going to rip apart, it has a lot of ramifications. So really think more about cost in use. If I pay a little bit more up front, will that actually save me money in the long run? That type of thinking will go a long way to make sure you're successful. The other big one is uncomfortable employees leads to noncompliance. We walk into facilities every day, and what we see is folks are often modifying their garments. They're cutting off sleeves, cutting slits in the side, things that at the end of the day, you're wearing coveralls for a reason, and that's to protect you. If you're making these modifications, you're not being compliant. So it just takes one splash of a chemical, one thing to get in that suit, and all of a sudden, there was no real point in wearing that suit anyway if you were going to cut off the sleeves and make that modification. And then last but not least is just a really big kind of overarching theme, and it's not that all white suits are the same. I think a lot of times what this type of PPE has gotten is just a kind of a commodity type feel, because at the end of the day everyone thinks that white suit's going to protect them just the same, and it's really not. And it's important to pay attention to the details, because those details can make a huge difference, especially when it comes to cost, quality, sustainability, and productivity. So really these are the things that I'd ask you to keep in mind as you are ultimately selecting what suit is right for you. So at this point, I just wanted to wrap up and say thank you. Thank you for your participation today. And again, thank you to MSC for allowing us to have this today. And for a quick second, I'd like to turn it over to Rebecca.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you very much for that. My name is Rebecca Avery. I'm a merchandising manager here at MSC. And I just wanted to take the time to say thank you to Kimberly Clark, our partner, and especially Mark for that great presentation. And just so you guys know, for more information about whether it be protective clothing or any other information having to do with safety, MSC has recently established BetterMRO, which is our content educational site. So you guys can log on to mscdirect.com/BetterMRO, where there will be a copy of a recording of this webinar as well as other webinars we've hosted in the past, videos, infographics, articles, all types of things all about education.